Welcome to the Art of Gardening. I'm your host, Melissa Lalo Johnson, and I am so excited to have Justin Henderson from PowellsWood Gardens, Botanical Gardens, here with us today. Justin, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy day to join us.
Oh, absolutely. It's my pleasure, Melissa. And it's nice to finally meet you on some other way other than just our Instagram accounts.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I'm really excited to have you because of all of the different gardens that I follow. Powellswood is one of the most magical, beautiful gardens I've ever seen. And I love all the different facets of the garden. So let's go ahead and get started and get some information
Yeah,
going. So if anybody is interested in checking to see Powellwood Gardens right now, you can visit their Instagram handle is at POWELLSWOOD. That is PowellsWood. And Justin, tell us about where you're located first and what type of gardening climate you have.
sure. So we are located just south of Seattle, Washington. We're in a city called Federal Way. And it's a city about 120,000 people. It's kind of the suburbs of Seattle. And so it's probably a place that a lot of people don't expect to find this little magical secret garden. We're just surrounded by homes. If you looked at like an aerial view of Powellswood, it's this massive green space just smack dab in the middle of urbanization. So we're 40 acres large. The garden itself, the cultivated area is 3 acres, which is really just a dot on the map compared to the remaining woodland that is the forest. But yeah, we're encompassed by houses. We have about 115 next door neighbors just all around surrounding the property. But so we're a little bit of a destination. Most of the gardens that you would find that are larger and public gardens are more concentrated in the Seattle area. And so if somebody comes and visits Powellswood, it's because like we really came to visit Powellswood. We didn't just stumble there. We're zone 8B, so fairly temperate. This last winter was a little bit colder than we would have liked, and so a lot of the plants that typically overwinter just fine, we saw them start to suffer a little bit. And then right now we're in the middle of this extensive drought. I was just in central Idaho and in the desert. And typically, when I would travel to an arid climate like that, it would feel totally unique. And unfortunately, even though we're in Western Washington, which is sort of like the rain capital, we haven't experienced really measurable rainfall for the last like 3 months. And so we had one afternoon where we got a couple showers. But yeah, it's been an extraordinarily dry midsummer and early fall. It's mid-October and we're still seeing temperatures in the 70s and no rain.
Yeah, that's wild. We've had kind of the same thing here, just very, very little rain. So let me ask you a question. How long have you worked there? And when did you start and what position did you start at?
Sure. So I've been at Palswood for 5 years. I am the garden director and started as the garden director. However, that position and that the responsibilities included in that position have varied drastically since when I first began. So I have a nonprofit background, not as much of a gardening background. And so when Palswood took me on, it was really so that I can help the organization. We're still a fairly new nonprofit 501c3, sort of build the infrastructure of the organization, kind of help us to find our footing a little bit and start to work towards more sustainable future for Powellswood. And so really spent so much of my energy the first 2 years doing that. And then this little thing called COVID happened and totally dramatically changed the landscape of Powellswood, literally and figuratively. So because of that, we operated also a landscaping company at the time. And the landscaping company helped maintain a lot of the properties that the Powell family owned. And we had to close that business down. And so we closed the landscaping company, which in turn meant we also had to lay off all the employees that we had for Powellswood. So we had myself who only did administrative, but then there were 5 of us on staff part time. And we sort of restructured, and we're still sort of in that position of restructuring Powellswood. And so there hasn't been much other garden help other than myself in the last few years. And so now I've been the one in the garden. We have a few outstanding volunteers, and some of our previous crew, they now have their own businesses, and we still bring them back occasionally to do some of the maintenance to help prepare for events and things like that. But Yeah, I've loved it. I've totally embraced it. I've seen it as an amazing challenge, and so even though the garden certainly can use a little bit more support in terms of our staffing, to be honest, there's this big selfish part of me that is just really enjoying having my hands in the garden and being able to kind of design as I please and see the garden really come into a vision that I dream of when I think of what a magical garden would look like.
It's absolutely magnificent. And I noticed that over COVID, your page really took off. I think with all of the different videos and seeing you more active and your hilarious personality, just kind of getting in there also with the magic of the garden.
Oh,
When you
good.
say about the Powell family, so is this a
Mhm.
private garden back a long time ago, or how are they involved in the garden?
Okay, so Monty and Diane Powell, they purchased the property in 1992. They've lived in that area since the early 60s, and that property is 37 acres was totally vacant. And they purchased that and they started a garden 30 years ago. And they're still around. They still live on the property. So in a sense, it is a private garden that is open to the public, even though we're specifically a public garden. Monty and Diane Powell would view this still as their own little personal oasis. When the garden is closed, they've often come in and they find it sort of as their own little retreat. So it's sort of this hybrid at the time of like the Powell family personal garden, and then open Tuesday to Saturday, 10 to 3 to the public.
That's wonderful. Wonderful. That's a kind of a dream, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so tell us about how do you maintain? So when you have your people that are helping you, do you use any master gardeners or any other like public groups of people that come in to help you?
Now, there's a lot of gardens in our region that do that partner well with master gardener groups or different societies. Like the Bellevue Botanical Garden is all volunteer ran almost, with the different zones that are separated horticulturally. And like there's the Fuchsia Society that maintains the Fuchsia Garden. PowellsWood doesn't have any of those associations right now. I could see us leaning on something like that more in the future. But right now, yeah, we have the three super dedicated volunteers and myself. We all sort of have different specialties, and so that really helps. Like for instance, I'm really poor at just like the nurturing of small plant material. So we have an amazing volunteer who comes in and deadheads and does all kinds of plant care. She has a wonderful eye for just seeing how a plant should be. She spent 30 years in indoor scapes and now she's retired, and so she's really good at discovering the health of the plant and diagnosing whatever might be wrong. And then we have a little bit of collaboration on any design concerns that might come up, because my design, I like it to be a little bit more loose than typical garden community does. And I'm just fine with plants kind of creeping all over each other, almost crowding each other out. I've been accused of overcrowding plants often, which is totally fine with me. When I look out in nature, plants certainly aren't properly spaced. So it doesn't really bother me too bad to have a garden with plants that are all sort of fighting for sunlight, and they're sort of in a way they're happier in some aspects. And a lot of that I think has just in thinking through this, I think a lot of it has actually created an ambiance. It's also helped with our weed prevention, which is nice because we don't have a lot of open mulch, and so there's really no opportunity for some of these plants to germinate and to find sun, just simply because the plants are so close to each other. They don't really have the space. The weeds don't have the space to grow up. But then I also believe that there's some evaporation control as well. With the density of the plantings, there's not as much evaporation taking place because they're not getting direct sunlight down at the bottom of the surface, and so the moisture isn't. And so I find that there's a lot more moisture retention, which helps us to be more sustainable as well.
So you said it was vacant land. So vacant as in pasture? Was it cleared land, or did they plant the
Yeah,
trees, or was it just a forest?
great question. Okay, so most of it was a forest. It's second growth forest. It was all logged about 100 years ago, and then just left to regenerate. And so what we're seeing now is the alders. It's a whole forest of alder trees, mostly deciduous. There's some big leaf maples in there, and they're all kind of getting to their 100-year lifespan. So they're actually starting to fall on us. But The property, yeah. So it's that there's a natural spring in the middle of the forest, and so it's sort of maintained by the county to make sure that nothing was happening in this specific region that could be detrimental to the natural spring that actually helps supply water to our region. But there was also where the garden is now, which I think this is the most fascinating aspect about Powellswood. There's actually a real dump site. So a developer owned the property for a few years before the Powells purchased it, and there was a house on where the garden is even before that. And so when Monty Powell purchased the property, there was concrete debris, there was vehicles scattered throughout the property, just tons of garbage. And so he said he had to spend 3 years restoring the land just to be able to plant. He is not exaggerating when he says this, that nothing would grow there, not even weeds, is what he says. And I mean, I don't fully believe that because I know weeds actually a lot of times do enjoy neglect and really harsh conditions. But he said there was just nothing. And when I look at photos of it, like it really is true. It just looked like a really derelict piece of land. And there was no topography. So when Monty Powell purchased the property, had an extraordinary vision on how to transform this dump into an urban oasis. And he hired a landscape architect, Ned Goldblum, and he came in and separated the garden into different garden rooms. So now it's 6 different garden rooms. And before it was just this slope, but there was major erosion problems. And he divided up that slope, terraced it, and put in a working stream to capture stormwater. Just brilliant design. And that sort of created the playground now that I just get to have fun. I didn't have any role in the development of the garden and creating the structure that is certainly the highlight of Powellswood.
Okay, so Justin, our friends at PETRATOOLS are wanting to offer you a gift for your time,
Uh-huh.
and we have a choice of 3 different options. Let's see which one you think could work best for you. So, first of all, is the revolutionary mulch glue.
Uh-huh.
Supermax will keep everything together in the garden,
Uh-huh.
especially the mulch. The fabulous organic worm tea,
Uh-huh.
1 gallon of that, or 1 gallon of grass paint.
Wonderful.
So, Justin, you have big decisions to make today. What's it going to be?
Well, I'm gonna have to go with the worm tea. I've been so curious about trying that in the garden, and I know that it can have great results. So looking forward to trying that. Thank you so much. That's amazing.
Yes, of course. Well, enjoy, and we will get this out to you soon. Thank you. All
Thank you. Appreciate it, Melissa. Okay.
right. Bye bye.
Bye.
So, Justin, can you tell me when you speak of these rooms of the garden, what exactly are the rooms and what purposes do they serve?
Yeah, so the garden is broken up into 6 individual rooms. It's sort of based on Monty and Diane Powell. They loved visiting Britain, and they were so inspired by the UK and the formal garden rooms. Where every single room where you walk into has a different plant aesthetic, and it has a different feel to it. And so they really wanted to create that at Powellswood. So they divided it up, and the house garden, aptly named, is just right behind the home. It's I like to call it the patio garden. So on the patio, it's your opportunity as a homeowner or anybody to really just do whatever you want. And this garden is just all about you. It's the closest to your home in my mind. And so you might as well just have fun. You're more likely to take care of it. You're more likely to look at it. And so usually it's a lot of color and containers. Now, this garden is about 100 feet long. This garden bed is about 100 feet long and 25 feet deep. And so there's quite a bit of space to be able to garden here and sort of do whatever we want. And so it's a lot of tropical plants during the summertime. It's a very seasonal look. So if you came in the springtime, there would be, you'd see full of spring ephemerals. We plant a ton of bulbs in this garden. But yeah, like I said, so much of it is really geared towards this big summer show. So right now you go through the house garden and you see these big tropical plants. You see the Musa basjoo, which is the hardy banana. We have these massive stands of them. And those kind of create the backdrop for a lot of the smaller tropical plants that we're sort of playing with, the alocasia and the colocasia. We have a lot of phormiums and cannas, things that, to be honest, aren't very typical in the Seattle region. We have palm trees, the Trachycarpus fortunii. We have a few different varieties of those. And we have the loquat, the Japanese loquat, which a lot of people look at and they're so amazed that we're growing this in the Seattle region. And so, the way that we have always branded ourselves is a Northwest garden. And people come to PowellsWood and they see all these tropical plants and they say, wait a second, this isn't Northwest. Well, it's becoming more and more common in our region to grow plants that are outside of what we're typically used to. Typically, what you'll find in other Northwest gardens are a lot more Japanese maples and alpine conifers, very low-lying things. Sort of muted colors, a lot of ferns and rhododendrons, azaleas. And although we have all of those plants in our garden, we're not tied into any particular plant palette. We don't like to be told, I suppose, what our garden is supposed to look like. And so our tropical display in the summertime, which is still happening right now, it starts looking really outstanding in early June. And because the temperatures haven't fully receded, we're still experiencing these massive displays. And so it's a lot of foliage, a lot of texture, a lot of combinations that people aren't adjusted to seeing. We throw dahlias in there and some sunflowers just to mix it up. And we have Senecio nivioris, which is the angel wings. It's this silvery looking plant, and even though it's widely available at all the nurseries, for whatever reason, a lot of people are unfamiliar with it. And so they see it at PowellsWood and they get really excited. And we sort of tie that in with different combinations, however we see fit. So we go from that patio garden, then we go into the entry garden, which I'm sort of rebranding in my mind as the oasis garden. And it still has another tropical feel to it, but it's much more subdued. So it's very green, it's very verdant, it has a more relaxing feel. So in the patio garden, it's like color display, your eyes are overwhelmed, all your senses are totally captivated. And then you go into the oasis garden and it's tranquil. And so there's the Trachycarpus fortunii, the windmill palms, right in the center, and surrounding that is a lot of evergreen display. So that's where we actually start to incorporate some cooler rhododendrons, and it has a really good feel to it, very relaxing, all in a circle, exactly like how you imagine like an oasis in the middle of a desert. And it's surrounded, like I said, by, we do have some Japanese maples, and so it's surrounded by these large stand of Japanese maples. And then to the left is a European beech that was supposed to be maintained at like 20 feet tall, and now it's a skyscraper. 30 years into it, and it's like 100 feet tall. So it sort of towers over that whole section of the garden. But that's one of my favorite spots. And what I find so fascinating about it is it's like equally as enjoyable as the patio garden, yet it's like almost entirely low maintenance. I spend maybe a dozen hours a year in that garden, as opposed to, the countless hours, hundreds of hours in the patio garden. And so it's a really enjoyable display. Then you go down the stairs, and as you're walking down the stairs, you see that stream that I kind of mentioned earlier. That's capturing the storm drain water. And so the storm drain is actually going into a pond, and then we're pumping it back up to the top of the stream bed. And so it's constantly recycling. That storm water is getting cleaned before it goes down back into the forest. And we're right next to the Puget Sound, the ocean. And so it's going into the beaches just right below us. And so it's really important that we're able to clean that water before it goes in there. So you see that as you're walking down the stairs, and that's our one place. We're always adapting it, but it feels very Northwest, that specific part. So we have these mountain hemlocks and rhododendrons all as you walk down, and we're adding, you can't help but start to get a little bit more tropical. And so that's just probably my leaning more than anything. And so I am adding plants occasionally down those stairs that are changing a little bit of that feel to make it feel a little bit more like you're in the middle of a jungle. Which is sort of how I dream about gardens. And then you walk through down there, and then all of a sudden it opens back up. So it's really narrow. There's a lot of narrow passages and then wide open spaces, and narrow passages and wide open spaces. And so we love creating vignettes, that surprise you. So you're going down the stairs, you're a little bit claustrophobic, plants are surrounding you, and you get to the bottom of the stairs, and then there it is, this expansive lawn surrounded by two large perennial borders. And so those perennial borders, still working on those. Historically, those have been like the best part of PowellsWood. Monty and Diane, like I said, they were so inspired by British gardens and seeing the formal perennial gardens, the classic designs by people like Gertrude Jekyll, and so when they first started the garden, that was one of the very first things that they implemented. They had a designer come who was outstanding with this, and she just drew it all up, just like basically on a napkin. Oh, this is what you need to do. And she knew all the plants that needed to happen. But because I was unfamiliar with perennial borders, those areas have been a little bit more neglected when I started. And so my attention's starting to come down into these areas. And I'm learning that it's a lot harder than I thought it was. You know, you think you just look at a magazine, get some ideas for different plants, and then put them in the ground, and how difficult can it be? So this last year was very humbling for me, to be honest. If you look on our Instagram, I rarely show the perennial border because I feel like it's still a work in progress. Whereas other areas of the garden, we've really got it down. But the perennial border certainly has created some challenges for me. And so learning about the conditions, for instance, in one area of the perennial bed, it's clearly full sun and it has good drainage. And so I bought plants for this whole entire area, but I didn't realize until I planted it, and this probably happens with all gardens, that this one area is actually way shadier than I ever realized, and it doesn't drain well. And so all those same plants that thrive just 25 feet down the row they just look horrible. And so it didn't turn out how I dreamed about it, this little fantasy perennial border. But that's okay. I'm actually appreciative of the fact that gardening isn't always easy, and that it does require some learning. And so it's back to the books and back to studying, back to looking at magazines. And I'm so glad that I didn't feel like I'm just like a wizard where I just say, oh, just do this, and you look exactly like Tom Stewart Smith's designs or Pete Odolph. It's just those guys are at their level where they're at simply because of their experience and their knowledge. And so getting on with the garden, you walk through the perennial borders, and then there's the pond. And the pond used to be, like a really formal area as well. There was the pond lilies looked outstanding. There was a fence surrounding the pond, and it was very aquatic plants, like really well maintained and curated. And now it's just a very natural, almost a bog, simply because of like we mentioned, the lack of staff. And kind of throughout the whole garden, you start to see that it's a more natural area probably than it ever has been, both because of my style and just because of the lack of hands that are on it. One of the things that I've read, I think Christopher Stone, the former director at Chanticleer Garden, he mentioned how you can over garden. And that is one of my pet peeves. When I see a garden that is just too perfect, it's too manicured, there's nothing out of place, there's no dying leaves, everything is totally set. I mean, no weeds at all. It's just so clean that it looks artificial. And so it's this dance of trying to not go too far with that, where it just looks sloppy and messy and unprofessional, but also creating a natural scape where somebody feels like it's inviting, they can relate to it. It feels in a way magical. Plants are kind of in their way a little bit. It's a little bit more of an encounter with plants. Sometimes I feel like gardens, it can almost feel like zoos, where you have to look at them from behind this safe fence and you say, oh, look at those plants, and everything is like well laid out. I like interacting with them, and why not have some plants kind of in your way a little bit? So you really see that when you're going down by the pond area. And then it opens up again. So it goes from narrow, then it opens up again into the shade garden. And in the shade garden, another beautiful low maintenance garden full of hydrangeas and hostas. We have these massive blue hostas. The only thing that we have to do, is deadhead the hydrangeas and make sure that slugs stay off of the hostas. And then there's the winter cleanup that we're always doing. But for the most part, this area full of ground cover, it's well shaded, it's mostly evergreen, it doesn't take a lot of management. And because of that, it also is one of my favorite spots. Then you go through the shade garden, which, by the way, is so fun because we also used to host, historically would have tea parties in the shade garden area. Diane Powell, there's a shed right next to it, and she would serve tea out of her shed. I mean, it's a shed, but it's a cute little home almost in the middle of the garden, and she would serve tea to her guests right there in the shade garden, which that little shed now is sort of being converted to a children's area. So that's exciting too. It's becoming like this little enchanted forest area. So we put this creepy gnome guy in there, which I'm still not entirely sure about. We're working on them, and kind of adding some fairies and some little more enchantment sort of in that area. But okay, so back to the shade garden. You walk through, and then you enter into the woodland garden. And the woodland garden, to be honest, is where I feel most comfortable. I'm from a very rural area close to Mount Rainier. You might be familiar with Mount Rainier. And so just surrounded by these huge Doug firs and hemlocks and western red cedars. I grew up in that. Like I grew up, my parents having no idea where I was. I was 75 feet up in a tree in the middle of our 5-acre property with these towering evergreens. And so I was way up there, and growing, just hanging out. Like I always joke about, I was hanging out with woodland creatures my whole childhood and building tree forts and things. And so I just feel really comfortable in the woodland garden. Well, what we discovered in the woodland garden, and that place is pretty sacred and special as well, because it was designed by Monty Powell's brother Craig years ago. And so we really treasure that area. But what we discovered was that moss thrives in this particular zone, and that was just recently discovered. As interesting as that is, we're 30 years into the garden, and 2 years ago we decided, hey, let's stop managing the moss and managing all the plant growth in the middle of this area, and let's just see what happens. And so we said, well, we actually started watering the actual, just the ground surface, because it was just really hard, compact clay soil, and it's densely shaded and a high pH because of the acidic needles that are falling down from the Doug firs and the cedars. And so it's ideal conditions for this particular moss that we have growing here, native. And so we just started watering the ground, and it looked so silly. We had a landscape crew come in at this time, and I remember them watching me spraying a hose on just bare compact soil, and they looked at me like, you are an absolute idiot. But I kind of had an idea of what was going to happen, and now it's there. It's reality. It's this wonderful carpet, this lush moss, and it's created this whole serene environment that was very unexpected, and it's become sort of a staple of PowellsWood. And it's surrounded by Polysticum minudum, the sword fern that we have so prolific here in the Pacific Northwest, that grows native. So much of the native plant life that people are comfortable and familiar with is right in that woodland garden area. Then there's an observation deck where you're able to go out on the observation deck and see the rest of the forest, and you can see the trail that leads you through the forest. There's a mile-long loop down in the ravine forest. Okay, so it's all, so 3 acres is all in a loop. So I hope it makes sense a little bit that I'm guiding you through a loop. So you walk through the woodland garden, and then you turn and come back up into the spring garden. And the spring garden it looks absolutely fabulous. In April and May, we have these huge, they're 30 years old, these cherry trees. They were the first things that we planted in the garden. So there's these Mount Fuji trees, and they're just fantastic. So they're Prunus shiratai, and somebody told me, this is recorded, so I probably got this completely wrong, but somebody told me it's like Japanese for like large white. And so these cloud-like blooms coming, and those are a huge desire for a lot of people during that time of year to come visit. And then we mix it up as well with a little bit more color with some of the spring blooming azaleas, and the garden looks really good, particularly in the spring. Outside of spring, that's another area that's sort of rest for your eyeballs. And so it's not far from that house garden that's full of color and pop and vibrancy, and it's a little bit overwhelming. The spring garden, the rest of the year outside of spring, is just very calming. It's very restful. It's very green and verdant, and it's sort of a way to refresh your eyes before you get overwhelmed again when you go see the house garden. Then we've also added some additional places. There's the fuchsia collection. PowellsWood has a massive collection of hardy fuchsias, And so we have, yeah, at the time when we purchased them, there was 250 specific varieties, and so we bought 3 of every variety, so 750 hardy fuchsias in the fuchsia collection. And that's up by the Powell's home. There's another little formal garden in that area that we open up occasionally during different times of the year. Then we also we purchased another property. The Powell's purchased another property that they built a parking lot with, and that parking lot is another. It's it's a parking garden essentially. You park on turf, and in that turf, it's all reinforced with plastic cones, and they're like little hex. It's like plastic hex network that is right underneath the surface, and then grass growing through that. So you don't know, a lot of people are so cautious about driving on it, and they're worried they're going to destroy our lawns. Well, the parking lot is totally built for that, and so that's where we park the cars and mow that lawn where all the cars park, and that's surrounded also by a beautiful garden full of hydrangeas and more conifers and dogwoods. It's quite a display, and that's where we're able to do a lot more with grasses and things that don't require quite as much irrigation as other parts of the garden. So there you go. There's like the garden in
Yeah, that's incredible. So if you're listening to this on the podcast, I definitely encourage you to check out the YouTube, because we're going to get clips of all of these different rooms that Justin is talking about to let you see the beauty that he's detailing here for us. So tell us about what types of pests and issues in the garden do you see, if any? Do you guys have Japanese beetles? Have they made their way there to you yet? Or are there other things that you battle with year to year?
Well, thankfully, we don't have Japanese beetles. So that is not something that is on our current radar. But we're kind of always looking at how can we do our best integrative pest management practices. And so throughout the garden, we're always keeping our eyes on anything that might be coming up. Thankfully, and it might be because of our proximity to the woodland, and the habitat that we've created. It's a very natural environment for predators to thrive. And so there's a lot of pests that basically don't stand a chance, because we have so many birds, we have so many predatorial insects that are in there getting rid of a lot of the harmful insects. And so we've created a habitat that is a lot. It's very self-sustaining, and that's simply because it's surrounded, in my mind, because it's surrounded by that adjacent forest. And then also a lot of the plants that we have too, especially in our beds, are seasonal, and so we do quite a bit of annual displays and things that were or they're only out of the garden for a few months, so then we're bringing them indoors, or we're composting them and then putting a new display out there. And so if those plants have pest problems, they just go. So like almost like they would in a conservatory. If there was any kind of issue, they just don't belong in the garden, and so we just eradicate that. We have massive slug issues, and that's endemic to, or I mean, it's not just endemic to the Western Washington, but it's a real problem in Western Washington. We have these European slugs, and so we spend a lot of time taking care of them. We use some different products to help ensure that our slug population stays down. One of the things though that I do on a daily basis is I go and I walk through the garden and I just lift up leaves and I kind of look around and I try to find slugs and just pick them off by hand. I found that that's definitely the best way to manage our slug population. I'll find that a whole entire hosta plant will just look devoured, and you say, oh man, it's just infested with slugs. And then you start to look closer and you see it's really just two massive hungry slugs that had just been munching on your hostas. And so we're not at this point, we're not required to do much in terms of pest management and spray. A lot of that has to do with how we've built the garden. I can see us having to deal with that in the future, and so we're always kind of being conscious of that and taking good notes and ensuring that all the plants have a chance at a healthy life. We, like, for instance, there are a few disease issues like the brown rot on our cherry trees on the Prunus shirotei. That is also a significant problem here in Western Washington. And so we try to avoid spraying chemicals whenever we can, but we understand that there are moments that it is necessary. And so we have been spraying those cherry trees for the brown rot. And because of that, we're giving them like a second life. Even though they're 30 years old, that is really helping them. And so they're continuing to look good for the future.
Yeah, and I didn't realize it was that warm there. I mean, that's a whole zone, cooler than California and Florida, right? So it's
Right.
it's pretty temperate there year round. So when you're doing garden cleanup throughout the seasons, here in Missouri, everything's dead in the spring, right? So I can just kind of mow over it or clear everything and be done with it. How does that impact you when you have temperate seasons and you're trying to balance what's alive versus what has gone dormant?
Yeah, so it used to be much easier for us because we were only open April through October, and now we're open year round. So the garden, we try to make it look good year round. Whereas before, we would just only try to make it look good April through October, and then we'd be near the end of October, and we would essentially do a lot of what you're talking about, and just do some major winter cleanup and mowing, But and then the garden would look pretty empty up until April, and then that's when it would start to come back to life. Now we kind of do it in stages, so we do it very gradually and try to delay it as long as we possibly can for the sake of the pollinators that are living on these dormant plants. We don't want to destroy their habitat, and then we also want to leave a lot of the seed heads up for the birds and other wildlife to enjoy. And so we take it down plant by plant essentially. Whereas prior to COVID, because COVID is when we chose to be open year round, we would just do a massive fall cleanup, and then any finishing touches come springtime. So now we're trying to make it a healthier garden overall. And a lot of that has come just by, well, that plant, like for instance, right now we have a Joe Pye weed, massive, it's like 8 feet tall and 8 feet wide. And you try to hang on to it as long as you can to where it's looking good. And this, again, it's this balance because we're a public garden. Otherwise, it'd be so nice just to leave everything totally dormant and leave everything up until springtime, until like March, is when the temperatures really start to finally thaw out and start to get warmer, and new buds are coming up. And so it'd be so nice to just leave the garden up until that point, and then do cleanup. But because we have to think in terms of our staffing and our capacity, and then also keeping it looking good all year round. So like that Joe Pye weed, as much as I love it, it's starting to really flop, and the blossoms on those, when they dry out, they just don't look as good as other plants do with their dead heads. And so like the Joe Pye weed, it's about to just entirely go. So we're going to have to miss this big chunk. But we'll leave other plants around it that are surrounding it that the birds can continue to enjoy and such. So.
And then I'm assuming when you take something down like a Joe Pye weed, I mean, I know right here it's like kind of like this raggedy, kind of whitish, grayish, plumes.
Yeah.
I'm assuming you're cutting those and either redistributing them to different areas or putting the seed pods back in the spot. How does that work, and what types of things do you do that with? Like, what are you spreading by seed pod that spreads very easily for you?
Yeah. So with the Joe Pye weed, because it would take over such large parts of the garden. We're not looking to spread that one. And so we're just going to cut it all the way back down to the ground, and let it, stay dormant all winter, its root system. And then we will just compost that and turn that into mulch. The other plants, though, like for instance, we have the candelabra primula, which are prolific at PowellsWood. Those love that stream area. They're riparian in nature. And so we do collect all the seeds from the candelabra primulas, and we continue to spread those. So when we're doing winter cleanup, yeah, like my friend showed me, you just pull your hand off, remove all the seed heads, and just throw those before you dispose of the rest of the plant. And so we are thinking in terms of mass distribution on those. Like I said, we're primarily a summer garden, and so if we can get any spring color, then that's huge. And those primulas really provide that spring color, and we've come to kind of rely on those. And so we spread those as much as we can. And you'll see when you come to PowellsWood in May, there's just hundreds of those primulas all throughout the garden, and that is a lot just from hand distribution, and then they hybridize and turn all kinds of crazy colors. But I like what you're saying, and I think that's something, to be honest, that we can continue to grow in and learn through. Yeah, just because we're a display garden, we're always considering, what the next year will look like, and making it more sustainable. And so sounds like you have some great ideas on that, Melissa.
Yeah, thank you. I just it's actually Kurt Wilkinson, so he's very big on
Yeah.
kind of taking what you have and redistributing it and spreading it. And so over the last, I've been friends with him for like 4 years now. So over the last 4 years I've really done that, and it's incredible when you, instead of just discarding it, right? And if you're not going to let it stay all winter, to be able to use it to spread. And I guess when you're cognizant of that, then you realize all the different opportunities there is to kind of spread everything and increase the capacity of the flowers that you have on your property for free, just with a little bit of
Yeah.
work every single year. Putting into that. So tell me, so we're getting close on time. Actually, we're way over on
Oh,
time,
are
to be
we
honest,
okay?
but
No,
this
I'm
is
so
too,
sorry.
this is too interesting. Um, Tell me about, what about events? Do you guys have anything coming up for through the season? Like what types of events do you guys host, if any?
Okay, so we do a few different events. We had a big Christmas light show this last couple of years. Unfortunately, we're not doing it this year, and that's simply because our garden just is, like I said, our staffing is a limited capacity. The garden itself, turf lawns everywhere, turf pathways, and so we had a couple thousand people come through on this turf pathways at the middle of December, and it was just an absolute monsoon when they were walking through, and it just completely destroyed our turf paths. And so actually the last one we did was in 2020, and we're still recovering on our turf from that time period. So unfortunately we had to cancel our winter lights show. We do members events where and kind of invite our membership in and just enjoy the garden in the evenings. And then we're open to a few rentals as well, but very low key in terms of events. We'll no doubt push the button again on events and step it up. But we used to have such huge events, and all of them we've just had to take a back seat on simply because of the sort of where we're at as a garden and sort of reconfiguring our direction.
So for someone who lives close by, tell us about what a membership is. What does it cost and what are the benefits of
Yeah,
having one?
yeah. Well, we would love to have you as a member. So essentially, it's like an annual pass where you're able to visit the garden as often as you would like. And there's an individual membership. We try to keep it very low cost and manageable. So it's $30 for an individual and $45 for a household. And that includes two guests and two members plus two guests. And then the individual one, you can bring a guest with you every time you come. And so we found a lot of our members enjoy that. Some members I see every single weekend, it seems like. And then other members use our garden as like a way to meditate, a way to relax, a place to unwind, and even do your reading or your work or whatever you need to do during the week. And so, yeah, then we throw on member specific events where we provide tours and music and desserts and different things to just say thank you to our members.
Do you give any opportunities for photographers to come in to do pictures for families or
Yeah.
brides or things like
Yes,
that?
we see that quite often. So senior photos, wedding photography, all sorts of different, senior pictures, different things that are happening in the garden, and we love that. That's the garden is totally open for that, and we find that this is a beautiful backdrop. I think what we struggle with at PowellsWood, like I said, it's such a destination in Federal Way that a lot of people just aren't familiar with it. And so I think once the photographers start discovering more and more that this is a great place for photography, we'll see that kind of pick up.
Well, you have done a wonderful, wonderful job with the social media for PowellsWood. I mean, it is fantastic. I do encourage our listeners and viewers. It is a brutal, brutal world in the social media world these days. So if you have any opportunity to give us a like, a comment, a save, a subscribe, whatever it may be, please do help us get the word out about beautiful, beautiful botanical gardens like PowellsWood. Justin, can you tell us where else we can find you or find more information about PowellsWood?
Yeah, so the Instagram page, PowellsWood, is certainly where we're doing most of our activity. You find a video or two a week that come up on there, and then interacting with the stories and things like that. Also, our website, PowellsWood.org, or you can find us on Facebook as well. You can find us at one other place that's a great resource that we have here in Western Washington. It's called PugetSoundGardens.org, and it highlights the best botanical gardens, public gardens that are in Western Washington, and PowellsWood is one of those that are featured on there. That's PugetSoundGardens.org, and you'll learn about not only PowellsWood, but many of the surrounding extraordinary gardens.
Well, thank you so much for your time today, and thank you for all the information that you've given us. We appreciate it, and I'm looking forward to being able to share your beautiful garden with Instagram. So thank you so much.
Oh, a pleasure.
Take care, and we will definitely have to have you back on again to talk more
Okay.
about the care and maintenance of the garden. So
Would love
thanks so
to.
much, Justin.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.